we're recording. Okay.
You need us to introduce ourselves again?
No, you don't need to do that. You don't need to introduce yourselves again. This is the third time in 2 days I've forgotten to hit record right away, so don't worry about it. We'll know who's there. So the idea behind this was to think about ways that we can keep our students connected to each other, connected to their intellectual work, connected to their advisor in spite of all these interruptions that are going on and all of the distractions. And also in spite of, or in the face of, how dispiriting this must be to be a senior doing your first capstone project of your academic career, and then suddenly it's kind of all thrown to the wind. And what I was saying in the webinar just an hour ago, where we were talking about text-based projects and ways of organizing, advising, and boards, you know, I was saying to the folks there that when I did my PhD defense several years ago, it had been pushed off and pushed off and pushed off, and then it ended up coinciding with the birth of my children, so I had to do it online. And it was really a bummer. I mean, I really felt like it took away from the experience, and I wish that there had been some more thought put into how we could have done it so that I could have felt like it was celebratory and also intellectually rigorous, rather than just a hoop I had to jump through. So I think that's part of what we want to be able to talk about today, ways we can keep the students moving towards that goal, knowing that that goal will be something that they can be excited about, and that they can take away from their Bard experience, whichever Bard campus they're on. So what I'm going to suggest is that Mariya actually gathered some thoughts from AUCA students. And rather than starting where I was thinking we were going to start, I think it would make sense for us to start with those thoughts, what they have to say about the things that they're concerned about. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste it into the Zoom chat so that you can take a look at it.
And while you're doing it, if I can give some context to, you know, what you guys are going to be seeing. Is that okay, Rebecca?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. In terms of, you know, where I sourced these testimonies from. Okay. I sourced them from AUCA's peer tutors. So that is people who are, this is the top 1.5% of the AUCA student body in terms of, you know, in terms of sheer GPA, and they come recommended by their departments, by the individual professors. They are very engaged in extracurricular activities. They are actively headhunted by companies, and they are probably the most resilient bunch, you know, the most overachieving and yet resilient bunch there is. So it's not your average student that is behind on his senior project and is using COVID as an excuse. So that is, you know, those are people that are generally significantly ahead of the curve. And so I could say that what you're seeing would be pretty legitimate complaints, as opposed to, you know, excuses for not being able to turn in one senior thesis, or, you know, blaming the global pandemic on, you know, for being behind or something like that. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so you should all have the document.
Yes.
Everyone, are you able to open it?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. I'm not going to bother screen sharing since we can take a look at it. I'm just going to give you a second to kind of skim through this. You don't need to read every word. Sure. I literally cut and paste this from what the students wrote, so there's no editing. But just skim through it and just see what comes out of this. You know, what are some of the concerns that the students are raising? And then we'll talk a little bit about this and talk a little bit about some ways to address some of these things. So I'll give you maybe 4 minutes just to take a quick scan through.
Sure.
Okay, so we'll wrap it up. And Mariya, I'm gonna ask if you can kind of help facilitate this conversation, and I'll write some things in the chat. My twins walked in and I have to quickly get them out of here.
Absolutely. Okay. So sounds good. Okay. So I guess I guess the question is at this point is what have we observed? I mean, let's try to. I mean, we can start it in the list form, and then we can perhaps group those problems and discuss in terms of potential solutions how we can support students. Okay, would anybody like to contribute?
I'll do the writing while you guys chat, since I have to be on mute.
Sure.
So Mariya, I wanted to say that it actually seemed like of the 4 concerns that we read, there are actually 3 that I identified that came across.
Yes.
As separate categories. So one is the ability to feel connected to your advisor, which was actually quite clearly stated by that particular student. The inability to collect data or to access, I mean, to broaden this out, right, to access archives, to access the library, to access sources. And then the question of whether or not the thesis is going to make sense, either because you're not able to meet in the same ability with your advisor or with your working group, or because the curtailed ability to access resources is going to allow you to write something conclusive. And I think that really emerged strongly as the kind of 3 points that students are concerned about that actually transcends whatever field they're working in.
Sounds good. Jerry, what do you think? Maybe perhaps something jumped out that you...
Yeah, I thought the same thing pretty much. I actually wrote down 3 categories when I kind of was just reading through that as I was making notes, pretty much exactly the same. And I've actually heard from students, a few seniors that I've been talking to, really worrying about the quality of work and that their work will be judged less rigorously because of the situation, and they feel like they're kind of missing out on that opportunity to get that kind of interaction. First of all, I mean, the practical kind of nature of meeting with an advisor is very different now as well. So I think those are really, so there's kind of like very practical things, I think. And then there's even, I think, maybe even concern about, you know, beyond this moment, how is the context of their senior project? I mean, if you're doing a senior project in economics right now, it might be kind of, you know, how do you take into account what's going on and kind of the impact of something like this as well? So I could see that also being an issue students might encounter.
So yes, so yeah, so the quality and whether it would actually make sense. It's interesting that all 4 people that left their, left these testimonies are in the business administration department. So I think maybe, you know, maybe that comes through. Yeah. So I think.
Can I add one as well?
Yes.
You know, I think building on this notion of worried about the quality of work and being judged less rigorously and remaining connected. Also, and I think Jeremy, you were kind of getting at this, you know, being worried about things outside of the project. Like one of the students wrote, the uncertainty about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think they just meant the job market or their senior project board. I think they meant the broader future. And that is extremely demotivating at a moment like this if you don't know what you're going to do with your degree.
Yeah.
So anyway, I put all of these notes in the chat function.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think that there is a practical way to address at least two of these, both the question of uncertainty about the future and also the question of inability to collect data. I'm a historian, so one of the challenges, and Jeremy has talked at length with members of the history program about this, is I'm trained as an early modernist and as an Atlanticist. Even in my day-to-day teaching at Bard, both for research method seminars and also for students who want to work on early modern topics, I cannot realistically expect them to be able to go to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford or the National Archives in France. We're very fortunate that sometimes some of our students do, but that's not a baseline standard. And so working in conjunction with Jeremy and Alexa in the library and Betsy Cawley, and thinking really creatively with my colleagues, we have found ways to allow them access to different archives. I think part of what makes this situation unique is that we are 2/3 of the way through the senior thesis process.
Yes.
But I also think it has been really helpful in talking to my students about the reality that researchers face regularly, which is effectively that people get thrown out of countries, archives go on strike. I work on French archives or with French archives. That's a constant reality. Natural disasters, such as the volcanic eruption in Montserrat, can destroy archives. And that writing about that process is very within the thesis. So to really take the inability to collect data and turn it into a productive part of the process so that they're still doing the work, and have them see that it's not, you know, it's not necessarily a space to bemoan like, oh, I'm never going to be able to find this data. It's how do you think through that and to make that a part of the completion of the project.
So, hello. Yeah, I don't know if I froze or everyone else did.
No, we didn't freeze. We're here.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
I think it's actually turning this into a teaching moment is actually a really good strategy for motivating students.
Yes.
Getting them to think about the reality on the ground of what research actually is, and you know, the lack of access that real researchers often face, or the interrupted access. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. So I think a lot of the theme that emerged very strongly here is, as Chrstian said, its ability to feel connected to one's advisor. And I actually was reading some forum postings from the composition theory class, and that's the class that prepares writing tutors, future writing tutors. And they're also in this interesting situation where they, you know, for half the semester, they were gearing up for their practicum, and they observed tutors, and they all were ready to get into this face-to-face practicum, which was going to take place after spring break. And then it turns out that all of the tutoring they will have to do is going to be online. And their thoughts were extremely defeatist, and I had to have a talk with them this morning about how this is, do not think of it as, as solely in terms of inconvenience and interruption, right? That this is, this is going to, it's not going to be the same, but it's not going to be the same. It's not necessarily going to be worse, but it is going to be different. And I think that this is the kind of conversation that we need to have with our students. That because I think that a lot of us are just waiting for things to get back to normal. I mean, and that the fact that this is the new normal, and these are the new parameters that you have to, that you have to function, that you have to function within. That is something that we need to tell our students as they are adjusting to this new reality. That's one point that I wanted to make. And another point is that the quality of advising is very, very important at this point, because this is likely their first major research project. And we don't know how to deal with a setback of this, this magnitude. And so they need somebody to be able to suggest alternative ways for them. One student actually mentioned falling back more on secondary sources because they can't get primary data, that sort of thing. And so the quality of advising at this point becomes key, and the close attention that the advisee receives, that is crucial, I think.
I think one of the challenges, though, in moving to this format mid-semester is that the advisors also may not totally know how to go from, what Chrstian was saying about, I'm also trained as a historian, thinking about, the ways in which we as historians often experience interrupted access to data. We don't necessarily think of that with our students unless they're already doing a project where from the beginning, they're not going to have access. So how to make that shift ourselves is kind of a challenge. And one of the things I'm thinking about with some of my advisees is even trying to connect them into something we don't do at AQB, is we don't have them working in small research groups. We do mostly one-on-one advising, which I think is the way it works in Annandale as well. We don't have them working in small research groups. So one of the things I've been thinking about is trying to get a Zoom research group going where not just my advisees, because I currently only have 2, but multiple advisees are getting together even a couple of times a week with guiding questions that either they've developed or that the faculty have developed. There's some great activities out there that the Experimental Humanities put together. There's also some other resources on the OSUN website of how to get students generating questions in an online format where it can be collaboratively done. I was thinking that, structuring a kind of Zoom research group around that for the remainder of the semester could allow them to present on the material that they do have, and also to start thinking a little bit more about raising questions about the material that they don't have and that they might not be able to get, and incorporating that into the project. But, using that questioning as a way to kind of connect them to each other.
To that point, I will say that the director of the Historical Studies program here in Annandale, Rob Culp, has actually put together a salon series for our history seniors to meet every Friday for precisely that reason. And in some ways it's because there is a way in which certain kinds of traditional fields like history lend themselves to a similarity of approach in spite of wildly divergent research topics, different geographic areas, different chronologies. And so that's worked really, really well. Because I also direct an interdivisional program, I will say that it's not always super easy to get students who are in extremely different fields, but under the umbrella of an interdivisional program like American Studies or Human Rights or Environmental and Urban Studies, to be able to have that kind of touchstone. In which case, I think Mariya's point about having regular access to your advisor becomes crucial. And finding out if you can do a miniature version of what you're suggesting, Rebecca, if there's somebody else, even if it's someone else working on a thesis in a different field, but someone who they feel connected to, where they can touch base on a regular schedule to be able to say, hey, how's it going this week? You know, what are you doing? It might be someone in studio arts and somebody in human rights, but that they know that there's someone sort of cheerleading for them. And I think that there's something that I started doing in my classes this year more broadly, and I think it's become incredibly helpful in this particular transition. We are not transparent about our own processes of research, our own intellectual lives in the classroom with our students. There is an emotional toll that certain kinds of work take, right? If you work on the history of violence, or if you work on histories of slavery, being in the archives or thinking about those topics are going to be challenging. That takes on a particular weight when you're also in a moment of global crisis. So that the normal suggestion of lose yourself in the work, this is actually a chance to escape into a different set of thinking, might not necessarily be true if you're thinking about, you know, the economics of inequality, where it's magnified every day on the news, and then you have to spend some time thinking about it. And so for advisors who have had the experience, or who know of other faculty who have had the experience of finding that balance, I think it's really helpful to be able to direct our students to speak to the experts who might give them the strategies of, you know, it's really hard to read certain kinds of testimonies. It's really hard to see certain kinds of data, but I know my colleague has done this. I'm sure that he or she would welcome an email or a phone call to suggest how you do this work. So I think really starting to build networks so that if there's not a salon that the students can go to, there is another faculty member who might be able to give them that additional support.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Chrstian, I think this is where the AUCA Global Network becomes a kind of opportunity. You know, it has drawbacks, of course, and, you know, but it also has it's an opportunity right now to think about ways that we can capitalize on these already forged connections and think about ways to tap into each other. Now, the question we're going to have is, what's the best way to facilitate that without adding to people's plates? Because I know myself, I'm spending so much time sitting in front of my computer. I think we all are. And, you know, even getting time to get up and run to the bathroom or deal with your screaming children or your pets or whatever you might have, it's complicated. So we also don't want to add to people's workloads. But I think trying to capitalize on these AUCA connections and connect students even between campuses, if they're working on something similar, could be really interesting. And maybe we just try it between 1 or 2 campuses with a couple of faculty rather than trying to do it at a broad scale. You know, what you're saying about interdisciplinary, connecting someone from studio arts with history or whatever, maybe we could do that between Bard College Berlin and AQB, or AQB and Annandale, or AUCA and Bard College Berlin. You know, there might be ways to do that we can bring people together in a wider conversation. So they also feel inspired by the fact that in this moment of global crisis, there's also students all over the world working towards this same goal and trying to finish this project in the face of this crisis under many different circumstances. Now, that in a way that doesn't create a lot of work, I'm not sure, you know, for our colleagues.
A couple of things I wanted to add to that. One building on the point that Chrstian made is about us not being transparent about our intellectual lives. And I think that students think that they spend so much time planning their research, right, that they're not prepared for any sort of a setback. You know, it has never happened to them. And they can't even conceive that it's something that happens to researchers on a very regular basis. And I remember maybe a couple of months ago, I was giving a talk to senior thesis students. And I was talking, and they got so much talks thrown at them. And they were still utterly confused. And the only way to get through to them, it turned out, was actually to talk about my own research, about the project that I carried out last year. And something, you know, at that moment, maybe it was just the critical mass has been reached or something, but it clicked for them, or for rather a lot of them. And so I think it's important to, you know, for us to tell them that, you know, that research doesn't happen smoothly, and that it is, you know, whatever career they are preparing for, even as, you know, the testimonies that you saw, they're sourced primarily from BA department. And it's like, what do you do as a business person when everything, you know, just falls apart, right? You know, well, you start looking for solutions. Okay, let's talk about, let's look for alternatives. So I think that that's important for us to tell them that we, you know, maybe we've never faced a disaster of this scale, but, you know, we definitely had our research setbacks, all of us, and to talk about how we dealt with them, you know, logistically, psychologically, and so on. That I think is very important. In terms of the workload, well, I'm not sure it's a very healthy approach, especially coming from somebody who already works 16-hour days. But I think that this is the moment when I think that we have to, you know, we have to prioritize in terms of, yes, we all got our libraries and so on and so forth to and in my case, writing centers to run. But I think that in terms of helping students cope, and as you know, what you said, Rebecca, about adding to the workload, I do not necessarily know how to, you know, how not to add to the workload. Maybe we just accept the fact that there is going to be more work. That at this moment, our first responsibility is to the students. And if we have to cut somewhere, right, the students is not where we should cut. That's just, you know, just my thoughts. You know, spend more time counseling and advising students, and because let's face it, I mean, we're all people in our 30s and 40s, right? You know, we are more equipped to deal with this than they are. So if there is anything that we can do as an older generation except die first, that is, you know, that is to help them cope.
How can we keep them connected to each other? I mean, it's easy for us to schedule meetings with them and to encourage them to show up and to check in with them. Mm-hmm. But beyond, you know, my suggestion was to put them in working groups, and Chrstian said that they're doing those salons in the historical studies, which I'd like to learn more about. How else can we get them connected to each other and connected to their topics? You know, how do we encourage them to continue to be passionate about their senior project topics when the world is falling apart?
I mean, I think there is a certain degree of compassion and flexibility that I think we need to have as well. Mm-hmm. Because to be quite frank, our students are in a huge range of living situations right now. We have students in Airbnbs because they can't go home. We have students who are home who are now tasked with the education of younger siblings because their parents are trying to work. We have students who are not in their home and are being hosted in someone else's home, and they don't know for how long. Yeah. So I do think that we all, I think, have to grasp, I agree with Mariya's point that we have a responsibility, if we as individuals have the capacity to give that to them, of being the support line, the backbone, the sounding post, then if we can do that, we should do that, absolutely. But I also think that there has to be a recognition for the students to feel safe enough to be able to say to us, I can't do this right now, and to know that that's possible. Because I think they are more connected than we expect, in the sense that they are a different generation. They're in constant communication with each other using many different forms of media. that, you know, we've all had to sort of learn on the fly. And I think, you know, I was part of the group that drafted those EH recommendations. One of the reasons that those recommendations look the way that they do was precisely because they were about thinking beyond a kind of typical academic setting that would allow a reflection on work that did not necessarily involve sitting in front of a computer screen or writing something.
Right.
And, you know, coming from the American Studies perspective, I think we need to have the students, at least this is what I've said to students in American Studies, reflect on, it may not be possible for you to write a project in the way that you envisioned.
Mm-hmm.
But maybe you could podcast your project. Maybe that's more in line with how you want to be able to work through this. Or maybe you can think about a kind of storyboard narrative that becomes part of the project so that you can take the work that you've done previously and add to this in a different way, so that they understand that we are willing to work with them on flexible solutions. Because I guess I'm a little wary of the sense of, you don't want them to think that we're not going to evaluate them with our full capacities. And that goes to Mariya's point of student concerns about, you know, you're not going to judge me. You're just going to sort of say, like, everything's okay, and, you know, we're all going to be fine, and it doesn't really matter what you did, right? We don't want to give them that sense, because that would suggest we're not invested.
Well, it also it doesn't value their work. It doesn't value
right, exactly. Work. But I think we also have to be able to say, if you genuinely can't do this the way that you thought you were going to be able to do this, then let's find a creative solution that will allow you to feel like you're still engaging your mind. It's just going to look different as an end product.
I just wanted to say two things. We are in somewhat different, I think, working in somewhat different conditions than you guys, because we award a dual degree, one from Bard and one from the Kyrgyz Ministry of Education, granted by the Kyrgyz Ministry of Education. And the Kyrgyz Ministry of Education has very specific, absolutely inflexible rules as to what a senior project has to look like. It has to be a written work of so many pages, and, you know, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So a podcast or something it's just not something that would be possible, for example, for us. So our students, you know, feel like it's a do or die for them. And they feel, at this point, they feel like die is a lot more likely than do. And I think that there definitely has to be some flexibility on part of the administration, at least in terms of deadlines and things like that. But that's, you know, that is something that I think that we as faculty, because students do go to the administration, and this is where our voice, where we can weigh in. That's important, I think. We can say, well, this is not realistic, they can't do it, you know, it was disrupted, it's going to take time for them. It doesn't mean they will not do it, but it will take some time for them to regroup. So putting our support behind the student might turn out to be crucial. I think that's one thing. Another is in terms of feeling connected to each other. It's really interesting how often I heard from this generation that was raised online about how disconnected they feel when they can't see, can't talk to the person face to face. Maybe it's specific to this culture, I'm not sure. But I think that all of us feel slightly different, different online than we do in real life, but that's just how it is. And I have been thinking about it in terms of my own group of tutors, because it took me a long time to build that identity of a work tutor and the sense of, and that sense that they're a team and so on, and I wouldn't want it to fall apart right now. And we usually have team building activities, which we obviously cannot hold this year. And I was thinking what we can do instead to make sure that that group doesn't, this group remains cohesive. And I think that some sort of shared experiences that go outside of the realm of the normal, so to speak. For instance, I was considering, for example, inviting a psychologist to, and holding an online session, because I know someone who specializes in groups, right? It's going to be a very different experience. It's going to take them out of that usual, their usual routine for a while, or inviting a guest speaker or something. So something that is different. I think that is important right now, especially because their lives are so monotonous. We have a curfew here, so they can't even go out of the house. So that I think that is important to them. Maybe that might turn out to be helpful, I hope.
Jeremy, you've been pretty silent. Is there anything you want to add?
Some of this doesn't really necessarily, because I don't have advisees and things like that, but it's actually a lot of really great ideas that I'm just thinking about in terms of my class a little bit too, that I teach, just being more flexible about the kind of final product that they do. I do know that students have certainly, I've been in touch with a few seniors that are living in the area locally around Annandale, in Red Hook and the town nearby. And I know they definitely have their own kind of informal networks where they're communicating and working together. I think I'm probably privileged to know the students who probably are more engaged anyways, and probably more likely to stay engaged with their work. But I know they certainly have expressed certain concerns, but they're doing their own things as well. Kind of maintaining those, like setting up workspaces to kind of work on their senior project, and like delineating kind of like time and trying to kind of make sure they keep up with that. So those are the things I think, definitely we can encourage those things for students to kind of reach out to each other as well, to kind of help them through this process of staying engaged with the senior project.
I mean, to Mariya's point about having to work to the standards of two different institutions, or two institutions meaning bureaucracies.
Right.
That I think is a unique challenge. And, I do think that one thing to consider in terms of resources and connections between folks at AQB and folks at other campuses like the Annandale campus would be to maybe reach out to some of the folks who teach in BPI, where the students don't have access to the internet, don't have access to a ton of resources, but are expected to produce a thesis that meets the traditional BARD standard, and how BPI faculty have really worked around that, which would be one place to get certain types of ideas that might work. I do think, I don't know how this would work given Kyrgyz infrastructure, but in meeting with my own thesis advisees, or the students who I was the outside reader for, I actually found it was a lot easier to start having the meetings by phone instead of video conference. And I think that there's a way in which it's less physically taxing. And so that seemed to help the students somewhat. It also meant we were, you could do this in a Google Doc as well, right? And then you're both editing simultaneously, but somehow it seemed to work better for us to trade back and forth, where I would use track changes and edit the document, and then we'd both be looking at the document, we'd both be able to kind of walk through this together. But it made it more seamless. I mean, I will say the ones that I'm advising have stuck with a traditional written project. And to just think about, okay, well, if you're on the phone, read me that paragraph, and then I'm going to tell you what I hear. And then we can go back and forth in terms of writing. And that has helped a lot, that kind of coming back to the practice of you as the listener, what's the topic sentence? I mean, the really kind of basic building blocks of writing that then, it's a bit like going back to a fundamentals class in yoga, right? Or a fundamentals class in painting, or I have a 6-year-old, so a lot of my references have come from this. But there is something actually quite soothing about going back to, okay, well, let's just focus on, is this a clear paragraph, to get through the panic that leads to writer's block? Or, you know, because bias as a historian, if you're feeling like you can't work right now, work on the footnotes. Don't let Zotero do that for you. This is an excellent sort of mindless activity to help get through these processes of writer's block, or make sure that the formatting is correct. And those sorts of things where it feels you are working, but it's a different kind of work. The other thing that I found that was actually a really low-tech solution that my advisee said really worked for her was to try writing by hand, to just kind of get something by hand on paper, because it's what I do when I have writer's block. And it's always been helpful because the stakes feel different. Like somehow if I'm not typing it, it's not real. And then the process of translating that into typing, as you're typing it in, you start to revise in that process. So I think all of it, since you run a writing center in particular, you probably have a lot of these strategies already there. And really kind of what you would use for training your own staff, to give that to the students might help them to work through that. And that's something, to go to Rebecca's idea, students can work on together. Say, you know, call somebody up and just read them this paragraph and see what they think. Or, you know, describe the concept for your collage and see what they think. And that too will help that human connection. But I really, maybe this is my bias as a kid of the 90s, but I'm all about that telephone, because I have found it to be the much better substitute.
Yeah. It actually does feel different. I agree with you. I am probably opening up a huge can of worms here right now, and this is a problem that we're not going to solve anytime soon. But I'm not sure how it's structured at Bard, and how many advisees would a faculty member have, and have on average. Senior thesis advisees.
It varies, at least on the Annandale campus. So the literature program has a policy of trying to make sure that faculty have no more than 2 advisees in literature. But because people can serve multiple programs, so I'm affiliated with 9 separate programs. So normally, this is an unusual year for me, but normally I carry 4 senior theses advisees, because I'll have 2 from history, 1 from human rights, 1 from American studies, or some combination thereof. So there can be a lot of variation in advising loads.
The reason I'm asking is because our advising loads are probably quite unimaginable, because basically we can have a department of 80 people with 4 faculty members, as is the case, for example, with our International and Comparative Politics department. So basically, each faculty member would have an average of 20 advisees. And that, of course, is not humanly possible. It just is not. So, so I think in cases such as ours, what the suggestions that were made earlier, I think, about people talking to each other and relying on each other. And so an advisor might not be able to get through all 20 advisees, right? Give them that kind of personal attention, but at least organize that process, facilitate it, make sure that it's well run on a regular basis. I think that is something that one absolutely can do.
And certainly, Mariya, at Elk Hood's Bard, we're also in a similar position where I only have 2 right now, but I know our human rights program has 13.
Yeah.
You can't read every single paragraph that the student writes and go back and forth with them. This is where I think this also, and I realize we're supposed to end at 10:55, so we have 2 minutes left. But this is where this crisis presents an opportunity too, because we can think about ways to bring the students together virtually and do some group advising, whether it's on the phone or on Zoom, and get them into working groups. and get them responding to each other, even with, guided feedback forms of some kind or guiding questions, and do some more peer response as well, so that then they're connecting with each other, but also maintaining some kind of intellectual rigor and advancement.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that this is, I mean, we talk about collaborative learning, but it sort of gets a lot of the times pushed to the side. When I tell my students that they will learn more from each other than they will learn from me, they don't believe me at first, right? And probably a few years down the line of teacher-centered classrooms, they forget it, right? So maybe it's time to bring back that idea. You are each other's best resource, and and like I said, and we facilitate that process of and pair them up or organize groups and things like that.
So I think, as a way to kind of wrap up, if we have any additional thoughts or ideas that we want to share, we can share them out via either myself or David Shine. I'm sorry we didn't have a larger group, but I think we had a good conversation, and hopefully it gets us thinking and also connecting with each other and brainstorming. And hopefully we can continue to be in touch. And if we come up with other approaches, let's make sure that we share them widely, because something that might work really well in Annandale could easily work well at AQB or at AUCA. And it's important in this moment that we're really sharing those best practices.
Yeah.
Can I just say, for the record, and this is where I think Jeremy and Alexa have done extraordinary work, looking forward to future groups of rising seniors who are going to, in the wake of this, have this memory. The more that faculty can share resources that can be used across the network, digital archives, oral histories, data sets, pools, I think that would be extraordinary, because I think it would relieve the stress that your students are experiencing, Mariya. I think it goes to what you want, Rebecca, of really forging connections across the network. I know Jeremy welcomes the 70,000 emails of like, did you know the New York City tax records are online?
Yes.
So, really kind of pooling those resources so that our students know that that is available. I think
that's a good point.
And we have online guides that we can create to kind of offer those things and create central location, which makes it much easier for everybody to access.
Just like something important that can come out of this crisis.
Incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think those are really good points, Chrstian and Jeremy. If we can use this as an opportunity to create pooled resources, and people can figure out where to go for things without always emailing Jeremy or whomever and asking, it could actually produce something really useful for the future too.
Well, every conference actually usually ends up with with this really good intention of creating pooled resources, and then it never happens. I am really hoping that this is, this is what it will finally take.
Yeah.
For us to.
We do have a resource page for OSUN, and that's a good start, given how quickly we did it. I think we're on the right path of thinking of ourselves as more of a global network where we can share information and maybe even pool resources continuously and not just in crisis. So.
Sounds good.
Anyway, well, thank you for coming. I don't know, there was one person who was silent who just chatted us and said thank you, but I don't know who it is.
That is from a person from AUCA, actually, a colleague of mine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, hello. Okay, thank you.
Elira, did I read that right? Elira?
Elira.
Good.
Yay! That's the best Cyrillic reading I've ever done in my life.
Well, thank you everybody for taking the time, and it was good to connect, and hopefully we'll continue to be in touch.
Thank you for organizing that, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.